Mixing up documents at the notary, the businessman's wife found someone else's will. And seeing her husband's last name, Sarah got up in a wonderful mood. Last night they finally got the documents, and today they were supposed to pick up Richie, the little one from the orphanage. Married to James for over 5 years, everything in their life went smoothly and very successfully. The family business they built with their own hands brought in not $1 million, but quite stable income. The house they bought 3 years ago was, as they say, a full cup. But having children just didn't work out. They tried everything, turned everywhere, but the hope of having a baby was fading. And then they decided to adopt. They chose Richard almost immediately, as soon as they crossed the threshold of the orphanage for the first time. The boy approached them and, looking at Sarah with his huge eyes, asked, "Are you my mom? Did you come for me? I've been waiting for you so much." Sarah's heart tightened, and she, picking up the boy in her arms, hugged him tightly to her chest, trying to hold back the tears. But despite his 5 years, Richard was very clever. The caregivers said that until he was 2 years old, he lived in love and attention, and then his parents died in a car accident. And with no relatives to turn to, the boy ended up in the orphanage. And now, on this happy day for Sarah, they were supposed to pick up their son in the second half of the day. Humming softly her favorite melody, Sarah headed to the kitchen to prepare James his favorite omelette with tomatoes. Usually, the house and the kitchen were taken care of by the maid, whom James decided to hire. But from the first day of her appearance, Sarah insisted that she would continue to cook breakfast. She wanted to wake up and eat alone with her beloved husband. And when they went to work, Mary Ann would come. She had been working in their house since they moved in. James persuaded Sarah to hire a maid, seeing how increasingly difficult it was for her to cope with all this household chores. The wife was the chief financier in their firm, and she had to devote a lot of time to work. "Good morning." James came out of the bedroom and kissed her, adding, "Oh, how I love it when you quietly hum and cook something delicious." She smiled in response and joyfully said, "Here, wait. Today we'll bring Richie, and there will be porridge, cheesecakes, and casseroles. I promise to spoil you both every morning." Over breakfast, they discussed plans for the day, and Sarah said, "You go to the office, and I need to stop by the bank, then to the tax office, and a couple more places. We need to do everything before we go to the orphanage." James looked at her and couldn't help but smile. She was so happy when she talked about the baby. Even if he wasn't very enthusiastic about the idea before, now he definitely didn't regret the decision. Sarah seemed to have become a few years younger. She already looked quite young, and at her 30s she didn't look older than 25. But now she was just glowing. While her husband went to the office, she went to the bank. It was necessary to deal with the opening of a new account, then go to the notary's office to issue a power of attorney to the secretary. They decided with James that now, when she would be busy with the baby a lot, all the minor issues of receiving, renewing, and processing documents could be entrusted to Sammy, the secretary. Thinking it would take a little time, Sarah decided to visit the notary's office right after the bank, and then go on to the other matters. The power of attorney was issued quickly, but some technical issues prevented her from receiving the document itself. The notary, apologizing, asked her to come back a little later in a couple of hours or the next day, and Sarah decided not to waste time. In these couple of hours, she went to the tax office. The young assistant handed her a folder and smiled, wishing her a good day. And Sarah, without even checking, immediately went to the car. She was about to throw the power of attorney on the back seat, when suddenly she decided to take it out of the plastic file and put it in her bag with the other documents. The first thing that caught her eye was the title of the document. Instead of the power of attorney, Sarah was holding a will in her hands. Glancing quickly over the first lines, she was literally stunned. The secretary had obviously mixed up the folders, and by some ridiculous coincidence, Sarah was holding her husband's will, but it was made out to someone complete unknown to her. Sarah reread the text again and again, unable to believe it. After all, James had no reason to make such a document. He never complained about his health, and he had been sick only a couple of times in their married life. and now a will. And not for her, his lawful wife, but for someone named Mrs. Jennifer Freeman. A lump rose in her throat. Sarah, horrified, thought that this Jenny could surely be her husband's mistress. She didn't want to believe it. She and James had a great relationship. They loved and trusted each other in everything. And now, it seemed to her, they even became happy parents. And suddenly, this. After sitting in bewilderment for a few more minutes, Sarah suddenly took out her phone and took a picture of the document, then put it back in the envelope and went back to the notary's office. She still didn't understand what she would do with these photos, but she really wanted to figure out the situation. "Excuse me," handing the envelope to the secretary, she said. "You gave me someone else's document." "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know how it happened. I'm sorry again. Here's your power of attorney." Leaving the notary's office, Sarah thought that perhaps the fact that she remained under her maiden name after marriage led to the fact that they, being at the same notary, didn't even suspect such confusion could happen. But on the other hand, now Sarah knew about her husband's will and still didn't understand what to do with it. One thing she knew for sure. This happy day for her should not be overshadowed by anything. And after lunch, calling James, she waited for him at the doors of the orphanage, with her heart pounding. Her husband arrived with a bunch of bright balloons and a fluffy teddy bear, which Richard was very pleased with. Sarah looked at her husband and couldn't find any changes in him. He was still affectionate with her, and she didn't see any health problems. Deciding that she definitely wouldn't make any decisions today, Sarah immersed herself in taking care of her son. When they got home, the first thing they did was bathe the baby. For about 40 minutes, he happily splashed around in the huge bathtub, pretending to be a fish, then diving into the water and popping out, shouting funny things. "Mom, Dad, look what I can do in this." After having fun enough, he finally agreed to get out. Then they all had dinner together, and it was so good and warm in the soul that Sarah even momentarily forgot about what had happened to her during the day. Although from time to time, she still secretly watched her husband, he was completely happy and laughed cheerfully when Richard said something funny. James didn't look like a seriously ill person or a cheater ready to leave everything earned to a complete stranger. Then they put Richard to bed together, taking turns reading him bedtime stories. When they lay down that evening themselves, James hugged her and affectionately whispered, "How much I love you, and I am immensely grateful that you persuaded me to take in this rascal. I really want you and Richie to be happy, and I will try to do everything in my power." The last words he spoke were with a kind of sadness, as if not willing to share this happiness with them. Sarah silently pressed herself against her husband and began to think about what to do next. She couldn't sleep for a long time that night, and in the morning, she had a plan. They had agreed in advance that once they picked up Richard, Sarah would work remotely for a while, only going to the office in emergencies. Both of them understood perfectly well that the baby needed time to adjust to the new life. In the morning, as if nothing had happened, Sarah saw James off to work, and as soon as his car disappeared behind the gates, she went to his office. Throughout their married life, she had never allowed herself to dig through his things or his phone, but now she understood it was simply necessary. Sarah was scared in her soul. She was afraid that her husband was seriously ill and trying to hide it from her. Deciding to find something that would help her unravel this mystery while Richard was sleeping, she began to carefully go through the documents kept in James' desk drawer. Imagine her surprise when she found a stack of some test results and a medical card in one of the drawers. The card was from an unknown medical clinic. Without understanding anything, she flipped through all the papers, and in the card she found a diagnosis that didn't tell her anything. Sarah immediately went online to find out what this disease was, and the more she read, the scarier it became. The disease was incurable, and from all descriptions, it was clear that such patients do not live more than 6 months to a year. Sarah read, and tears ran down her cheeks. She couldn't believe that her James could die. Reality was brought back to her by Richard's voice coming from the hallway. The baby called out anxiously, "Mommy, Mom, where are you? I'm already awake. I'm here, sweetheart, coming." Don't cry, my good boy. Sarah responded, and putting the documents back, closed the drawer of the desk and went to her son. The whole day her head was in chaos. Now she understood why her husband had made a will, but she couldn't understand why it wasn't for her, but for some unknown woman. Sarah categorically ruled out or didn't want to entertain the thought that James had a mistress. Throughout the years they were together, he never gave her reason to doubt his feelings. Moreover, most of the time they spent together at home or at work. At some point, she even thought about talking to him, but then decided against it because she would have to admit that she had been snooping through his things. Moreover, she would have doubted his fidelity. Sarah, still not believing in an affair on the side, decided to find out everything herself first. The day flew by unnoticed. The hardest part was pretending that nothing had happened when her husband came home. Seeing how happily he smiled playing with Richie, Sarah tried to imagine him with another, but couldn't. He was her own, beloved, only one. But some chill settled in her heart. The next day, as soon as James left for work, Sarah found a detective agency and arranged to meet with a detective at a cafe nearby. "Mary, I'm going to be away for a couple of hours. Will you stay with Richie? I can't take him with me. He'll get tired, I think," she asked the housekeeper and set off to meet him. Felix, the detective, listened attentively to everything, asked her to send him a photo of the will, and promised to find out everything as quickly as possible. The few days he didn't call seemed like an eternity to Sarah, and when he finally showed up, she went to meet him with fear in her heart. On the one hand, she was eager to know who her husband had decided to leave everything to, and on the other hand, she didn't want to find out that he did indeed have a mistress. But Felix surprised her. It turned out that the stranger lived in a village and was at an age where she could be, well, James's mother if she were alive. Getting all the information from the detective, Sarah thought about what to do on her way home. This woman definitely couldn't be related to James because he himself was an orphan, and that's what played a decisive role when they adopted Richard. Approaching home, Sarah had already decided that only an open conversation with her husband, no matter how much she didn't want it, could clear everything up. Spending the whole evening gathering her thoughts, she thought about how best to present it, and after putting her son to bed, she decided to have a talk. "James, we need to talk," Sarah began timidly, afraid to look her husband in the eye. "I know about your illness and the will. Don't ask where from. I'm just curious who the woman is you're planning to leave everything to." James was puzzled for a few minutes, but then gathering himself, he replied, "This is going to be a long conversation, so let's sit down. I'll try to explain everything to you." Sarah didn't know what her husband could tell her, but she was ready for anything and wanted to understand his actions. James said that he had known this woman since the day he arrived at the orphanage. Mrs. Freeman, as it turned out, worked there as a caretaker, always took pity on him, and even took him home a few times. After a minute of silence, he continued, "When I was about 10, there was a terrible fire at the shelter. Most of the building burned down. I didn't tell you, but I once had a brother who was a year younger. After our mother's death, they sent both of us to that orphanage, but during the fire he disappeared. Or rather, he was simply not found among the survivors, and everyone who wasn't found was immediately listed as deceased. After the fire, Mrs. Freeman took me in for a while, and was even ready to adopt me, but they didn't allow her to. They said she was alone and her age was approaching retirement. But for a long time while the orphanage was being restored, I lived with her." Sarah could see that it was very difficult for her husband to remember that time, but she didn't stop him, wanting to understand this unclear situation. James, pausing as if trying to remember, continued, "Mrs. Freeman became a second mother to me. She gave me so much warmth and care. After the fire and the loss of my brother, I stopped talking altogether. You can't imagine how much effort she put into curing me. She spent all her modest savings paying for the best psychologists. If it hadn't been for her, I might have remained mute for life." Taking Sarah's hand, he looked her in the eyes and said softly, "I'm sorry, but upon learning about my illness, I made the decision to leave everything to her." Sarah, it seemed, understood her husband's emotional impulse, but in this story, not everything was as clear as it seemed. I understand that she helped, she began to say, so maybe allocate some kind of lifetime support, but why leave the business to an elderly person? James abruptly cut off his wife. That's it. It's not up for discussion, I've decided. Besides, I'm only bequeathing my share of the business, and yours stays with you. I think I've explained everything. Let's go to bed. I need to get to the office early tomorrow. Almost all night, Sarah thought about this mysterious will. There was something in this story that didn't allow her to see the full picture. Some secret, some unspoken truth that kept bothering her. The next morning, as soon as James left, she dialed Felix's number again. She wanted to know everything about this caretaker, down to who she was, what she did, and how she lived. Please figure this out as quickly as possible, and let me know right away, Sarah pleaded. My husband's days may be numbered. I need to figure it all out in time. Surprisingly, after 3 days, the detective called and suggested meeting again, this time at the same cafe. When Sarah arrived, he was already sitting at a table with a cup of coffee, and almost as soon as she sat down, he began to speak. It turned out that the caretaker had been retired for many years, but she had worked for some time after that. Then her health deteriorated, and she had to retire, so she rented out half of her house to a young girl. When Felix mentioned where her tenant worked, Sarah almost choked on her coffee. It turned out that this Zoe, as the detective called her, worked exactly at the clinic where her husband was being treated. Trembling with excitement, she said, "Felix, I feel that something is wrong. Please, I won't skimp on the fee, but we need to find out if this girl is involved in my husband's desire to make this will." She told him everything she had learned from James, after which the detective, smiling mysteriously, said, "It seems I have a plan. Give me a few days, and I think this beauty will tell us everything herself." Sarah really wanted the story to end quickly, her husband to stay alive, and everything to be forgotten like a bad dream. The time until Felix's next call was lived in terrible tension, not knowing what to expect. Every morning she begged her husband to undergo another examination at a different clinic, and she kept insisting on bringing the caretaker, if she meant so much to him, to live with them, but he kept brushing it off. Sarah couldn't calm down, starting each day with pleas. After a few days, James finally relented, and scheduling an appointment at a clinic near the office, promised to stop by there after work. Strangely enough, it was on that day closer to lunchtime that the detective called, and Sarah, leaving Richard with the housekeeper, immediately went to meet him. Felix was clearly pleased with the work he had done, and sat smiling at the same table. Greeting her, he said cheerfully, "Well, Sarah, your intuition didn't let you down. This Zoe turned out to be quite the scammer. Once, when your husband visited his grandmother, this girl overheard him comforting her. In that conversation, he mentioned that the pensioner shouldn't worry about money, that he would help her as long as he lived, and if anything were to happen, she would get his share." Sarah, burning with impatience, couldn't hold back and asked, "But how did she get James to go to the clinic? He can't stand going to doctors after all." Felix looked meaningfully at her and as if deliberately paused before continuing, "I'm telling you, this Zoe is a con artist and not acting alone, but with her lover. He's the chief physician at that very clinic. As soon as she heard that the old lady might inherit the business, or at least a part of it, she immediately told everything to her lover. It was with their help that your husband ended up in their clinic. Can you imagine what they came up with?" One day, when your husband once again visited his caretaker, the tenant volunteered to make coffee while they were chatting. She discreetly slipped him a drug that causes nausea, dizziness, and even loss of consciousness, which happened that time. She immediately called a known doctor, who insisted on immediately going to the clinic and doing all the tests. Well then, as you understand, issuing fake papers about a terrible illness was a piece of cake. Sarah couldn't hold back and asked in fear, "Wait, but according to the will, everything would have gone to Mrs. Freeman if James died, and if the tests are fake, it means he's healthy. What would they have done next?" Taking another sip of his lukewarm coffee, Felix said, "These scoundrels planned several moves ahead. First, They planned to prescribe your husband medications that would slowly and without a trace send him to the other side. Then Zoe was supposed to gain the trust of the landlady, which she was doing quite well, and persuade her to sign a lifelong support contract with complete transfer of all property in case of death. And then, as you can imagine, following the same scheme as with your husband, slowly send her to the other side, something like that. Sarah sat trying to make sense of what she had heard and suddenly asked, "Felix, thank you so much, but how did you find out all this, if you don't mind me asking?" The man smiled kindly and said, "What's the secret? An old classmate of mine works in the police, and he dug up some dirt on this girl. Apparently she was already under suspicion, though in a different city. A woman she administered IV drips to died suspiciously, but the case was quickly hushed up there, so Frank managed to corner her so professionally that she spilled everything along with her lover. Let's just say," she confessed wholeheartedly, giving away all the details, "so live happily ever after, as they say, and the police will deal with these fraudsters." Sarah rode back in a lifted mood, and when her husband called and said he had passed the examination, she was almost sure he was healthy. That evening over dinner, she told him everything she had learned from the detective. James listened attentively and then said thoughtfully, "I don't even know how to react to all this. It's like something out of a detective story. Well, I'll stop by for the results tomorrow morning, and then everything will be clear." The next day, Sarah decided to support her husband and go with him, especially since she also needed to stop by the office for some documents. "Mum, can you take me with you?" "I'll behave well," suddenly Richard plaintively asked. Sarah's heart squeezed, but she squatted down, hugged him, and affectionately said, "My dear, we'll be quick there and back, and when we come back, I hope we'll have a reason to celebrate this evening together with some treats, like a cake, for example." Richard clapped his hands joyfully and suddenly asked, "So what are we celebrating? We only got cake in the orphanage on holidays." Sarah stroked his head and, looking at James standing by the door, said, "I really hope that when Daddy gets the test results, we'll be celebrating his second birthday." When they arrived at the clinic, James turned to Sarah and, taking her hand, said, "Thank you for everything, for just being there and for believing." She looked affectionately at her husband and said softly, "Thank you. I love you and believe that everything will be fine, and now that we have Richard, everything will definitely be even better. Besides, why do you sound like you're saying goodbye? I told you your illness is fiction, which will be confirmed by the new tests." James went to pick up the results, while Sarah, waiting in the car, was still very anxious. She closed her eyes and began to pray silently. After about 10 minutes, the car door opened and James happily got in. "You were absolutely right. I'm perfectly, well, almost healthy. In fact, it's good that I got checked. They only found some minor stomach issues, but they said it's treatable." He hugged his wife, kissed her, and said, apologetically, "And at first I didn't quite believe it, I mean about being poisoned and why it was arranged." Then, looking at his wife, he said joyfully, "Let's go get Mrs. Freeman right now. Mary seems to be struggling with housework and taking care of Richie. And don't forget, Mrs. Freeman is an experienced caretaker." Sarah agreed, and after sorting out all the tasks, they immediately hit the road. Mrs. Freeman initially tried to refuse, saying, "Where would I go at my age? And what kind of caretaker am I, after all these years of not working?" To which James replied, "We're not inviting you as hired help. Richard just needs a grandmother, someone to read him bedtime stories and take walks in the park, and your pies are our trump card. Even Mary, a former professional chef, can't bake like you. Anyway, it's not up for discussion. Get ready and let's go. After all, if you don't like it, we can always bring you back." From the first day, Richard started calling Mrs. Freeman Grandma, and she was happy about it. They immediately found a common language, and within a couple of days, the little boy was literally glued to her. Now Sarah could fully return to work, and she and her husband were once again fully immersed in the company's affairs. On their way home, they had already talked several times about how happy they were to have Mrs. Freeman in their home. Richard now delighted them every day with drawings or newly learned poems. Thanks to Grandma, the boys' day was literally scheduled by the hour, and every evening at dinner, he enthusiastically told his parents what they had been doing. "Mom, Dad, today Grandma Jenny and I went to feed the swans at the pond. They are so beautiful," Richard exclaimed, not waiting for a response, and continued. "And then Grandma made pancakes with jam, and I ate them all, and then we made a bear out of clay." Sarah and Mrs. Freeman smiled, while James tried to look stern. "You know it's all well and good, but remember what we agreed on? When I'm having my meal, I can't speak. I can't." "Here," Richard shouted loudly, and immediately grabbing his spoon began to eat. It was clear at that moment that keeping quiet was torture for him, and in order to quickly continue sharing his daily experiences, he tried to eat everything on his plate as quickly as possible. "Don't rush, little one," whispered Sarah to Richard, who was sitting next to her. "We're not leaving yet. You'll have plenty of time to tell everything." Now Sarah felt like the happiest person alive, knowing that her husband wasn't ill, and they would live long and happily. She noticed that, after everything that had happened, their relationship had become even warmer. It was as if they were afraid of losing each other, and were taking care of each other even more. Richard turned out to be an affectionate and intelligent boy, literally idolizing his parents, and Mrs. Freeman, who had been afraid of disrupting their lives, quickly became the closest and dearest person, not only to James, but to all family members. She was simply called Grandma Jenny, and from the outside, no one would believe she wasn't related. She radiated so much love and warmth. With the arrival of their new household members, James and Sarah's home became cozy and genuine, smelling of pies on weekends, and often echoing with children's laughter. It seemed like the whole story of James's fatal illness had faded into the distant past. One day, quite by chance, Sarah met Felix, the detective, in one of the supermarkets. Learning from him about the fate of the medical fraudsters, she shared what she'd learned with her husband that same evening. It turned out that the chief doctor was fired in disgrace, and Zoe received a suspended sentence with a ban on ever returning to medicine. 6 months passed. On this day, James and Sarah, as usual, were at work. Closer to lunchtime, the phone rang. Hearing Marianne's sobs, Sarah was greatly alarmed. Her heart literally clenched. Trying to calm down the sobbing housekeeper, she demanded sternly, "Marianne, pull yourself together and explain what happened properly. Is something wrong with Richie?" With difficulty, Sarah finally understood that Mrs. Freeman had suddenly felt unwell and lost consciousness. "Did you call an ambulance? I'll ask our doctor to come. He lives a couple of streets away and I'm on my way. And you, calm down, and please don't scare Richard. Everything will be fine." She said this, desperately hoping that everything wasn't as dire as Marianne described in panic. Sarah understood that at 80-something, a heart could easily fail, especially since Mrs. Freeman had complained a couple of times recently about chest pains, but adamantly refused to see a doctor. "Why bother the doctors? I'll live as long as God gives me. I'll take a pill, and I'll be good as new in half an hour," she would say in such cases. As Sarah approached the house, she saw the ambulance, and as soon as she entered, she immediately understood everything. According to the doctors, Mrs. Freeman passed away peacefully. Her heart simply stopped. We were powerless, you understand her age, and surely a whole host of accompanying ailments did their job. It all happened in a matter of seconds. Even if we had been there at that moment, it would have been impossible to help. Mrs. Freeman was buried in the village where she lived. It was her wish. Her death was a heavy loss for the whole family. Marianne kept wiping away tears. James walked around, sad and pensive, and Sarah herself couldn't get used to the fact that no one would lovingly say to her anymore, "Sarah, why do you rest so little? Take care of yourself. Look, I made your favorite apple and cinnamon turnovers. Have some tea." But while the adults could somehow understand that all people are mortal, Richard categorically refused to believe that Grandma Jenny would never come back to them. Several times a day, he kept asking, "Why isn't Grandma Jenny here? Where did she go? She said she had no one closer than me. Did I misbehave?" Sarah, barely holding back tears, tried to calm him down and explain, "You know, darling, you always behave well. You're such a smart boy, but sometimes Grandma Jenny loved you very much, and now she'll watch over you from afar and be happy for you." She didn't know how else to explain death to her son. Sarah started working remotely again to spend more time with him. Over time, Richard asked less and less about his grandma, but he would still say from time to time, "Grandma taught me this. We did it together." That morning, Sarah was getting ready for work when unexpectedly she turned pale and sat down heavily on a chair. James rushed to her. "Are you okay? What hurts where? I'll call the doctor right away." "Mary, water, quickly." After taking a few sips, Sarah whispered faintly, "It's nothing. It'll pass. My head is spinning and I feel nauseous like food poisoning." Marianne said in a frightened tone, "Oh, come on, what poisoning? All you had for breakfast was a couple of spoonfuls of oatmeal. There's no way you could get poisoned from that." "Well then," James began, his tone brooking, "no objections. There's no question of you going to work. Straight to bed. I'll call the doctor right now. And you, Marianne, keep an eye on her. I'll be calling, and I really hope you'll be feeling better by evening." Kissing his wife, James left for work, and the helper practically forced Sarah into bed. 10 minutes later, the doctor who lived nearby arrived. After examining her, he smiled mysteriously. "Well, what can I say? Of course, I can't be 100% sure until I get the results of your tests, but there's definitely nothing serious going on with you. Let's put it this way. You rest today, and tomorrow I'll see you at my clinic for a more precise diagnosis." By evening, Sarah indeed felt much better, but James still persuaded her to undergo tests. "It won't hurt. Remember how I didn't want to go to those doctors. But look, they found something not serious, but an illness nonetheless. If left untreated, any illness can become fatal." The next morning, feeling perfectly fine and not at all worried, Sarah went for her tests. All the tests were done quickly, and she was asked to come back in a couple of hours or the next day. She decided to find out everything right away. In those couple of hours, she decided to go to the office. When she returned, the doctor invited her into his office. With a wide smile, he said, "Well, my dear, my suspicions were confirmed. You're perfectly healthy, and on top of that, you're expecting a baby." At that moment, he barely managed to catch Sarah as she stumbled. She looked at him and suddenly began to whisper quietly, "This can't be. I can't have children. We checked 100 times. Where did the baby come from?" "Well, my dear, you know better than anyone where the baby came from. But the fact that it's there is certain, there's no doubt about it. Its little heart is already beating, and now you need to take care of yourself." Sarah couldn't remember how she made it to the office, and as she entered her husband's office and sat down, she burst into tears. Luckily, James was alone and rushed to her in alarm. "What's wrong? Did you find out something? Tell me, don't be silent. We'll use all our connections and money to cure you." He quickly poured water from the pitcher and handing it over asked, "Well, what's the diagnosis, can you say?" Sarah, taking a deep breath, blurted out in one breath, "I'm pregnant, James. I'm pregnant." Her husband stood there, looking at her as if he couldn't believe what he'd heard. Taking a sip from the glass he handed to his wife, he said in a trembling voice, "Repeat what you just said." That same evening, he finally persuaded her to take a nanny. "You understand now you need to take care of yourself," he reasoned with his wife. "You'll work calmly, and the nanny will look after Richie. With 2 of them, neither you nor Mary will cope immediately, so a new person will have time to get used to us before your childbirth." Sarah agreed, but finding a good nanny turned out to be a difficult task. Contacting several agencies at once, they met with prospective candidates, and when they saw Alice, their choice matched. The girl was modest, neat, and studying for a pedagogical degree through correspondence. From her first day at work, she became Richard's best friend, as the little boy himself said. He shared all his secrets and mysteries with her. In turn, Alice taught him to read, took him for walks, fed him. Basically, she flawlessly fulfilled her duties. James and Sarah couldn't be happier. Richard finally came back to life after his grandmother's death. His eyes sparkled as before, and the house was filled with the laughter of children. But after a few months, Alice fell ill. Early one morning, when the spouses were getting ready for work, the phone rang. It was the administrator from the agency where Alice worked. Apologizing, she informed them that their employee had been hospitalized with appendicitis and asked for permission to replace her with another nanny. The couple had no choice. They agreed and left, leaving Richard with the housekeeper until the new assistant arrived. Usually, the nanny had her own key and let herself in when the owners were already at work. But this time, upon hearing the creaking of the lock, Mary Ann hurried to open the door. From the first moment, the new nanny somehow didn't sit well with her. Mary couldn't explain it to herself, but there was something evil, unkind about her, even though she smiled radiantly. Moreover, the housekeeper noticed how attentively the girl studied the gallery of family photos in the living room. After playing with the child for a while, the nanny said she wanted to take him for a walk in the park. When they left, Mary felt a sense of unease and called Sarah. But she just smiled and said, "Mary, why are you being so paranoid?" "Well, the child went for a walk with the nanny. What's wrong with that? Relax, we'll be home soon." But when they returned a couple of hours later, Mary Ann in tears reported that the nanny and Richie had not returned. "Why did I let her go?" Wiping away tears, the woman said, "I didn't like her from the start. There was something repulsive about her, and she was staring at your photos in the room." Sarah tried to comfort her, although her heart was breaking with a sense of foreboding. The first thing she did was call the agency and get the nanny's phone, but it was switched off. Unexpectedly, James remembered that the neighbor opposite had a camera installed right above the gate, and they immediately went to him. Reviewing the video of the nanny taking Richard and leading him by the hand towards the park, James suddenly almost shouted, "Stop! Go back a bit and closer." For a second, he stared at the girl on the screen and turned to his wife. "Don't you recognize her? It's that vile nurse who tried to poison me. There's no mistake about it." Sarah looked at the screen again and whispered in horror, her hands covering her mouth, "Why does she want Richard? Where did she take him?" All evening, night, and the next morning, all the neighbors and acquaintances tried to find Richard around the neighborhood. Sarah was on the verge of a breakdown, and James was very worried about her. "Don't worry, we'll find him, and we'll hand that scum over to the police," he reassured his wife, but he himself was in no better condition. Summoning everyone they could, they learned the address where Zoe had been living lately. Now, there was no doubt that it was her, but she wasn't home, and they returned in silence, as if afraid to speak about their not-so-joyful thoughts. Suddenly, a man called unexpectedly and reported that he had found the boy in the forest. Sarah begged to go with him, but James insisted, "You'd better wait for us at home. You don't need any extra stress." Learning the coordinates of Richard's location from the stranger, James rushed there, and within about 20 minutes he arrived. The cabin was clearly not abandoned, as evidenced by neatly stacked piles of firewood under the awning and very clean rooms. The house was warm, with a fire burning in the stove. Richard rushed into his father's arms and whispered joyfully, "I knew you wouldn't leave me. I was waiting so much. Zoe brought me here and said we would play pirates who kidnapped me, but they would definitely let me go later. Then I woke up and she wasn't there, and I got scared." At that moment, a man entered, saying he was the one who called. His face somehow seemed familiar to the businessman, although they were unlikely to have met anywhere. James reached out and said, "Thank you very much, but how did you find him?" David, the rescuer, turned out to be a forester. "As usual, I was patrolling my territory," he began to explain, "and when I approached the swamp from a distance, I saw a fragile female figure. The girl clearly intended to end her life. I barely managed to persuade her to stop and share her sorrow. Zoe told me that she once tried to poison you for inheritance, and then when she lost her job because of you, she swore to get revenge. Medicine was closed to her, so she got a job at the agency. She would have possibly told everything herself, but after our conversation, I took her to the police. It was her wish." "But how did she find us?" James asked in surprise. David smiled, and at that moment, he again caught himself thinking that this face was familiar to him. "Your surname is well known in the city, and circumstances helped. When your nanny fell ill, Zoe found out where she worked and immediately offered to substitute for her. She thought it was a chance to settle scores with you. In her fervor, on emotions, she stole the child without even thinking about what to do with him next. She stumbled upon my cabin, woke up, realized the consequences of her actions, and decided to drown herself, leaving the boy here." Don't think she doomed him to death. She saw that the house wasn't abandoned, the firewood was stocked, and she knew that the owners would return soon. David got up and, taking off his knitted sweater, went to the stove to add some wood. He said, somewhat sadly, "You know, I talked to her for just a couple of hours. I feel sorry for her, poor thing, just lost in life with no one to guide her. She said her mother died in childbirth. She lived with her grandmother and an alcoholic father. As she confessed to me, she decided to go to the police herself, and in her situation that's quite something." The owner turned around, and at that moment, James noticed a large birthmark on David's arm. His heart raced, and his head spun. It seemed he would lose consciousness at any moment. It was impossible to believe what he saw. Only now did he understand why David seemed familiar to him. But that couldn't be. Taking Richard, who had been silently sitting on his knees all this time, off his knees, James said quietly, "Come on, buddy, stay here. We're going to Mum now, but I'll talk to Uncle a little more." Richard nodded in agreement and continued to drink tea with candies offered by the host. James approached David and asked, "Where are you from? Could we have met before?" David smirked in response and replied, "Yes, hardly. I'm just a forester and don't move in your circles. I'm from the orphanage myself, once lived in your city, and then when the orphanage burned down, I ran away, but was caught at the station and sent to the distribution center in the neighboring district, then to the boarding school, where I lived until adulthood, then the army, technical school, and now here." James looked at him without taking his eyes off, and understood. There could be no doubt this was his brother. Tears ran down his cheeks. "I thought you died in that fire. Don't you remember me? I'm your brother, dear God, can this be true?" David stood as if rooted to the spot and then rushed to him. "James, JJ, brother, I also thought you burned in that fire." A couple of weeks later, one morning, James asked his wife, "Sarah, tell me, what if they release Zoe? She's now my brother's wife. Will you be able to forgive her and welcome her into our home?" "I've already forgiven her for the sake of my brother's happiness. I can see how much he glows." Sarah, taking a deep breath, replied, "Well, for the sake of your happiness, I'm willing to forgive a lot and anyone. I can see how dear your brother is to you, so let's give this Zoe a chance." James smiled happily and hugged his wife. When Zoe was released, David brought her to their home, and from the threshold, he said, "Friends, I ask each of you to understand me. I've been so miserable and lonely for so long that I don't even believe in my own happiness. I've gained a wonderful wife and great relatives all at once. I beg of you, let's talk everything out once and for all. I want us to be a big, happy family, helping each other in every moment." At that moment, Zoe interrupted him and, looking into Sarah's eyes, said, "I now have two lives before and after." Taking David's hand, she continued, "Now I am loved, and I love for real. I cherish these relationships very much. Please forgive me, and if you can, give me a chance, and I'll try not to let you down." In the ensuing pause, you could hear a pin drop. James broke the tension by extending his hand to Zoe. "Well then, family peace, but with a probationary period, so to speak, like at work." Everyone laughed, and it seemed that this managed to calm everyone down. An hour later, the whole family was happily discussing Mary Ann's delicious blueberry pie, and Richard was demanding that Zoe play with him, recognizing her as his nanny. If you enjoyed the story, please support it with a like and a comment. All the best to you.